The autumn rain had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the sidewalks of downtown Seattle into mirrors that reflected the neon signs and headlights of passing cars. Natalia Ivanova pulled her threadbare coat tighter around her thin frame and watched the warmth escaping from the glass doors of Marcello's Italian restaurant. Through the windows, she could see families laughing over plates of pasta, couples sharing wine, and servers moving gracefully between tables laden with food. Her stomach cramped with a hunger that had become her constant companion, a hollow ache that never quite disappeared even when she managed to find something to eat. She had been living on the streets for 8 months now, though sometimes it felt like 8 years and other times like just yesterday. The details of each day blurred together into an endless cycle of searching for shelter, avoiding danger, and trying to maintain some small shred of dignity in a world that seemed determined to strip it away. She knew every doorway that offered protection from the wind, every soup kitchen serving hours, every place where she might find a bathroom without being chased away. This particular block had become part of her territory, and she recognized many of the faces that passed by, though none of them recognized her. Natalia stood across the street for nearly 20 minutes, watching the restaurant and building up her courage. She had walked past this place dozens of times, always noticing the old piano that sat in the corner near the bar. It was a beautiful instrument, or at least it had been once, a mahogany upright with ivory keys that gleamed under the soft lighting. Most diners barely glanced at it, too absorbed in their conversations and meals to pay attention to what was essentially a piece of decorative furniture. But Natalia saw it differently. She saw possibility. She saw a chance. The idea had come to her 3 nights ago when she had been unable to sleep, shivering in a doorway and trying to ignore the sounds of the city around her. She had been thinking about her hands, about how they used to move, about the feeling of keys beneath her fingers and the way music could transport her to another world entirely. Those memories were precious to her, perhaps the only things she truly owned anymore. And in that cold doorway she had made a decision. She would ask. The worst they could do was say no. Now standing in the rain with her hair plastered to her face and her shoes letting in water through holes she could not repair, Natalia forced herself to cross the street. Each step felt enormous, as though she were climbing a mountain rather than simply walking across wet pavement. She knew how she looked. She knew that people like her were not welcome in places like this. But desperation had a way of making the impossible seem necessary. The warmth hit her like a physical force when she pushed open the heavy door. The restaurant was busy for a Tuesday evening, nearly every table occupied, and the air smelled like garlic and fresh bread and roasting meat. Several people looked up as she entered, their expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort in a matter of seconds. Natalia felt their stares like tiny pinpricks on her skin. But she kept moving forward, heading toward the hostess stand where a young woman with perfect makeup and a crisp black uniform stood organizing menus. The hostess's smile vanished the moment she processed what she was seeing. Her eyes traveled from Natalia's wet, tangled hair down to her stained coat and broken shoes, and her mouth formed a tight line. Before Natalia could speak, the woman raised one manicured hand and said in a voice loud enough to carry across the nearest tables that they did not allow solicitation, and she needed to leave immediately. Natalia swallowed hard and forced herself to speak, her voice coming out quieter than she had intended. She asked if she might speak with the manager. She had a proposal, she said, something that might benefit everyone. The hostess rolled her eyes and turned away, clearly intending to ignore her. But an older man in a white shirt and tie emerged from somewhere in the back of the restaurant. He was broad-shouldered with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent decades in the service industry. His name tag identified him as Vincent, and he looked at Natalia with an expression that was not quite hostile but certainly not welcoming. She took a breath and spoke quickly before her nerve could fail her entirely. She gestured toward the piano in the corner and asked if she might play something in exchange for a meal. Just one song, she said, and if they did not like it, she would leave without any trouble. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke, betraying the anxiety that churned in her chest. Vincent stared at her for a long moment, and Natalia could see him weighing options in his mind. Behind him, several diners had turned in their seats to watch the exchange, and she could hear whispered comments and scattered laughter. Someone said something about homeless people getting more creative with their scams. Another voice suggested they call the police before she caused a scene or made other customers uncomfortable. The humiliation burned in her throat, but she kept her eyes on Vincent's face, silently pleading with him to see her as a human being rather than a problem to be removed. 23 years earlier, in a small apartment in St. Petersburg, Russia, a 5-year-old girl named Natalia had pressed her face against a frosted window and listened to the sounds drifting up from the music school across the street. Her mother worked 2 jobs to keep their tiny home warm and food on the table, And there was never money for extras, certainly not for something as impractical as music lessons. But Natalia would stand at that window for hours, mesmerized by the melodies that floated through the winter air, her small fingers moving in the air as though she were conducting an invisible orchestra. Her grandmother noticed this obsession first. Babushka Vera was a stern woman who had survived the hardships of Soviet life and believed that talent, when it appeared, should never be wasted. She began taking Natalia to the music school just to watch through the windows, and one afternoon, when a teacher named Professor Dmitry Volkov emerged for a cigarette break, Vera approached him with a boldness that surprised even herself. She explained that her granddaughter had a gift, that the child could hear a melody once and hum it back perfectly, that she moved her fingers as though the music lived inside her body. Professor Volkov had been teaching for 30 years and had heard such claims from dozens of proud relatives. But something about the intensity in the old woman's eyes made him pause. He invited them inside, led them to a practice room, and asked Natalia to show him what she could do. The girl had never touched a piano before. She climbed onto the bench, her legs too short to reach the pedals, and placed her small hands on the keys with a reverence that made the professor's breath catch. Then she began to play a simple folk tune she had heard her mother singing, picking out the notes by ear, making mistakes but correcting them instantly, finding her way through the melody with an instinct that could not be taught. Professor Volkov accepted her as a student that very day, waiving his fees and taking on the responsibility of nurturing what he recognized as exceptional raw talent. Natalia proved to be everything her grandmother had promised and more. She absorbed information like a sponge, practiced until her fingers ached, and approached each lesson with a hunger that reminded Volkov why he had become a teacher in the first place. By age 8, she was playing Beethoven's sonatas. By 10, she had won her first regional competition. By 12, she was being discussed as one of the most promising young pianists in all of Russia. Her teenage years became a blur of competitions, masterclasses, and performances. Natalia traveled to Moscow, to Vienna, to Paris, always accompanied by her mother or grandmother, always carrying the weight of their sacrifices and expectations. She loved the music with every fiber of her being, but she also felt the pressure mounting with each success. There were scholarships to maintain, reputations to uphold, and the constant knowledge that so many people had invested so much in her future. Sleep became secondary to practice. Friends became impossible when every spare moment belonged to the piano. Romance was a distraction she could not afford. At 17, Natalia auditioned for the Moscow Conservatory, one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. She played Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 with an orchestra, her fingers flying across the keys with both technical precision and emotional depth that left the adjudicators stunned. She was accepted with a full scholarship and praise that made her mother weep with joy. Professor Volkov, now elderly and frail, told her that she would make history, that her name would be remembered alongside the great masters. Natalia believed him because she had never known anything but success in the world of music. The conservatory years were both glorious and grueling. She studied under legendary teachers, performed in historic concert halls, and networked with conductors and composers who could shape her professional future. But the competition was fiercer than anything she had experienced before. Every student was a prodigy, every practice room filled with someone equally talented and equally desperate to succeed. Natalia pushed herself harder, sleeping 4 hours a night, skipping meals to fit in extra practice time, ignoring the pain that began developing in her wrists and hands. In her final year, at age 21, everything changed in a single afternoon. Natalia had been chosen to perform as the featured soloist with the Moscow Philharmonic Orchestra in a concert that would be recorded and broadcast across Russia. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the kind of exposure that could launch an international career. She had been rehearsing Prokofiev's Piano Concerto No. 3 for months, perfecting every phrase, every dynamic, every moment of technical brilliance. The pressure was immense, but she felt ready. She felt invincible. 2 weeks before the concert, her mother called with news that shattered Natalia's carefully constructed world. Babushka Vera had suffered a massive stroke and was in the hospital, unlikely to survive. Natalia took the train to St. Petersburg immediately, arriving just in time to hold her grandmother's hand as the old woman slipped away. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave that left her gasping and disoriented. Vera had been her champion, her protector, the person who had believed in her before anyone else did. And now she was gone. Natalia returned to Moscow in a fog of sorrow and threw herself back into rehearsals with manic intensity. She told herself that the best way to honor her grandmother was to succeed, to make the concert perfect, to prove that all those years of sacrifice had been worthwhile. But grief does not follow logic, and pain does not respect schedules. During a particularly demanding rehearsal 3 days before the performance, Natalia felt something tear in her right hand. The pain was instant and excruciating, shooting up her arm like lightning. She tried to continue playing, but her fingers would not obey. The conductor stopped the orchestra. Medical staff were called. X-rays revealed severe tendinitis and a partial tear in the tendons of her hand, injuries that had been building for years and had finally reached a breaking point. The doctors told her she needed complete rest for at least 6 months, possibly surgery and extensive physical therapy. They warned that she might never regain full function, that her career as a concert pianist might be over before it had truly begun. The concert was cancelled. Her scholarship was placed under review. The opportunities that had seemed so certain began evaporating like morning mist. Natalia felt as though the ground had opened beneath her feet, and she was falling into darkness with nothing to grab onto. The months following her injury became a nightmare that Natalia could never have imagined during her years of success and promise. She underwent surgery on her right hand, a procedure that left her with a long scar and strict instructions to avoid any piano playing for at least 4 months. The physical therapy was painful and progress came agonizingly slowly. But worse than the physical pain was the psychological torment of losing the one thing that had defined her entire existence. Without the piano, without music, Natalia did not know who she was supposed to be. The conservatory allowed her to remain enrolled, but her scholarship was reduced significantly since she could not perform or compete. The stipend that had covered her modest living expenses disappeared, and suddenly Natalia found herself struggling to pay rent and buy food. She took a job working at a small cafe near the conservatory, serving coffee and pastries to students who whispered about her tragic fall from grace. Every day she watched younger pianists walking past with their sheet music and instrument cases, heading to practice rooms and rehearsals, living the life that should have been hers. The jealousy and grief mixed together into something toxic that ate away at her from the inside. Her mother tried to help, sending what little money she could spare from St. Petersburg, but it was never enough. Natalia borrowed from friends, then from acquaintances, then from people she barely knew. The debt piled up like snow in a Moscow winter, cold and suffocating. She started missing physical therapy appointments because she could not afford them. She stopped going to classes because facing her former teachers and their pitying expressions became unbearable. Her hand healed poorly, the fingers remaining stiff and uncooperative, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. Depression settled over her like a heavy blanket, making even simple tasks feel impossible. She stopped answering her mother's calls because she could not bear to hear the worry in her voice. She avoided Professor Volkov's messages because disappointing him felt like betraying her grandmother's memory. Her apartment became a dark cave where she slept 14 hours a day and stared at the ceiling during the remaining 10. The piano in the corner of her room, a cheap upright she had purchased with her first scholarship money, sat silent and accusatory, gathering dust. It was during this period of darkness that Natalia discovered alcohol could temporarily quiet the screaming in her head. At first it was just a glass of wine with dinner, something to help her sleep. Then it became a bottle, then 2 bottles, then vodka because it worked faster and hurt less. The drinking provided a few hours of numbness, a brief escape from the relentless voice that told her she was worthless, that she had wasted everyone's time and money, that she should have practiced less and taken better care of herself, that she had squandered a gift that millions of people would have killed to possess. The conservatory finally expelled her after she failed to attend classes for an entire semester. Her landlord evicted her when she fell 3 months behind on rent. Natalia moved back to St. Petersburg with her mother, arriving at the tiny apartment where she had grown up with nothing but a suitcase and a soul full of shame. Her mother welcomed her with open arms and asked no questions, but Natalia could see the disappointment and fear in her eyes. This was not how the story was supposed to end. For 2 years, Natalia drifted through St. Petersburg like a ghost haunting her former life. She picked up occasional work giving piano lessons to children, though touching the keys now brought only pain and frustration. Her fingers would not do what her mind commanded. The music that had once flowed through her like breathing now came out stilted and mechanical, if it came at all. She continued drinking, hiding bottles around the apartment, and lying to her mother about where the money went. The guilt of watching her mother work herself to exhaustion while her daughter fell apart was another weight added to an already crushing load. Then came the message from an old conservatory classmate named Alexei, who had moved to America several years earlier. He reached out through social media, saying he had heard about her situation and wanted to help. Alexei claimed to be doing well in Seattle, working in the music industry, and he said he could get her connected with doctors who specialized in hand injuries for musicians. He painted a picture of new beginnings, of opportunities for talented people who had fallen on hard times. of a city where the past did not matter as much as the future. He offered to sponsor her visa application and provide temporary housing while she got back on her feet. Natalia knew, somewhere in the rational part of her brain that still functioned, that this sounded too good to be true. But desperation makes people believe in miracles, and she was drowning in desperation. Her mother was skeptical, warning her to be careful, but Natalia convinced herself that this was the sign she had been waiting for, the chance to start over in a place where nobody knew about her failure. She sold what few possessions she had left, borrowed more money she had no way to repay, and bought a one-way ticket to Seattle. The reality she discovered upon arrival shattered what remained of her hope. Alexei met her at the airport, but the confident, successful man she remembered from school had become someone different, someone harder and more calculating. The housing he had promised turned out to be a cramped apartment he shared with 5 other people, all of them involved in schemes and activities that made Natalia deeply uncomfortable. The job opportunities were non-existent. The doctors who specialized in musician injuries required insurance and upfront payments she could not possibly afford. Within 2 weeks, Natalia realized she had made a catastrophic mistake. Alexei became aggressive when she refused to participate in his business dealings, which she discovered involved selling counterfeit documents and running various scams on vulnerable immigrants. When she threatened to report him, he threw her out of the apartment with nothing but the clothes she was wearing and the small backpack that contained her few belongings. She found herself alone in a foreign city where she barely spoke the language, with no money, no contacts, no support system, and no way to get home. The descent from that point was rapid and brutal. Natalia spent her first night sleeping in a park, terrified and sobbing, wondering how her life had arrived at this impossible place. She tried staying in a homeless shelter, but the noise and chaos and constant threat of theft made sleep impossible. She attempted to find work, but without proper documentation or references or even a phone number where employers could reach her, every door closed in her face. She sold her grandmother's necklace, the last valuable thing she owned, for $40 that disappeared within 2 days. The streets became her reality, a harsh education in survival that bore no resemblance to anything she had known before. She learned which corners were safest, which soup kitchens had the shortest lines, how to avoid the police and the predators who saw homeless women as easy targets. She learned to make herself small and invisible, to keep her eyes down and her mouth shut. The drinking continued, because it was easier to be numb than to feel the full weight of what her life had become. Vincent stood looking at Natalia for what felt like an eternity, his expression unreadable as the restaurant buzzed with whispered commentary and barely suppressed laughter. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back, could sense the judgment radiating from every table. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. This had been a foolish idea, she told herself, a desperate fantasy born from too many nights with an empty stomach and an emptier soul. She was about to turn and leave to spare herself further humiliation when Vincent finally spoke. He told her she could play one song, just one, and then she would need to leave regardless of how it sounded. His voice was gruff but not unkind, and Natalia heard something in his tone that suggested he understood more about desperation than his expensive restaurant might indicate. He gestured toward the piano in the corner, and several diners groaned audibly at the decision. Someone called out that this was ridiculous, that they had come here for a nice meal and not to be subjected to some homeless person's delusions. The hostess looked at Vincent as though he had lost his mind entirely. Natalia walked toward the piano on legs that threatened to give out with each step. Water dripped from her coat onto the polished floor, leaving a trail behind her like breadcrumbs in a dark forest. She was aware of every eye following her movement, aware of the phones being pulled from pockets and purses, aware that people were preparing to record what they assumed would be either embarrassing or entertaining or both. She heard someone placing a bet with their dining companion about how quickly this would become a disaster. The piano sat in a corner near the bar, positioned at an angle that allowed it to be seen from most of the restaurant, but also kept it from dominating the space. It was a beautiful instrument, a mahogany upright that probably dated back to the 1950s or 60s, with ornate carved legs and brass fixtures that gleamed under the warm lighting. Natalia approached it the way one might approach an old friend after years of separation, with a mixture of longing and fear and uncertainty about whether the connection could still exist. She pulled out the bench and sat down slowly, her wet clothing leaving dark marks on the cushioned seat. Her hands were shaking as she placed them on the closed keyboard cover, feeling the smooth wood beneath her fingertips. For a moment she just sat there, breathing deeply, trying to calm the storm of emotions raging inside her chest. She had not touched a piano in over a year, not since the last disastrous attempt in St. Petersburg when her fingers had fumbled through a simple etude and she closed her eyes and thought of her grandmother, of Babushka Vera standing at the window of the music school with fierce determination in her face, refusing to let poverty extinguish her granddaughter's gift. She thought of Professor Volkov welcoming a small child into his studio and dedicating years to nurturing her talent without asking for anything in return. She thought of her mother working 2 jobs so that Natalia could chase an impossible dream. And she thought of all those years of practice, of competitions won and audiences moved, of the feeling that music was not something she did but something she was. Natalia opened her eyes and began to play. She chose Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, Opus 9, number 2, a piece she had first learned at age 13 and had played hundreds of times throughout her life. It was a work of profound beauty and melancholy, a meditation on longing and loss that seemed almost unbearably appropriate for this moment. Her fingers found the opening notes, soft and tentative at first, as though testing whether the connection between her brain and her hands still functioned. The piano's tone was rich and warm, clearly maintained despite its decorative status, and the sound that emerged was like water flowing after a long drought. The first few measures were uncertain, her injured hand protesting and her technique rusty from disuse. But then something extraordinary happened. Her muscle memory, dormant for so long, began to awaken. Her fingers started moving with more confidence, finding the notes not through conscious thought but through the deep understanding that comes from thousands of hours of practice. The music began to flow through her like it once had, like a language she had spoken since childhood, like coming home after years of wandering lost. The restaurant's ambient noise began to fade. Conversations that had continued despite her presence started to trail off mid-sentence. Forks were set down on plates with small metallic sounds that quickly ceased. The clinking of glasses stopped. Servers who had been moving between tables slowed and then halted, standing frozen with trays balanced on their palms. The hostess who had tried to turn Natalia away stood near the entrance with her mouth slightly open, her earlier contempt replaced by something that looked like shock. Natalia played on, unaware of the transformation happening around her. She was no longer in the restaurant. She was somewhere else entirely, in a place where only the music existed, where pain and humiliation and hunger could not reach her. Her hands moved across the keys with increasing fluidity, the right hand carrying the melody while the left provided the gentle, rolling accompaniment that gave the piece its dreamlike quality. The notes rose and fell like breathing, like waves on a shore, like the rise and fall of hope itself. The middle section of the nocturne built to a passionate climax, and Natalia felt tears beginning to stream down her face, though she could not have said why. Perhaps it was grief for everything she had lost. Perhaps it was joy at discovering that this part of herself still existed. Perhaps it was simply the release of emotions that had been locked inside her for too long, finally finding expression through the only language she had ever truly mastered. The transformation that swept through Marcello's restaurant was unlike anything Vincent had witnessed in his 30 years of running the establishment. He had seen marriage proposals and birthday celebrations and anniversary dinners that brought tears to people's eyes, but this was different. This was something that transcended the usual boundaries of a Tuesday evening dining experience and entered the realm of the profound. At table 7, a businessman who had been shouting into his phone about quarterly earnings slowly lowered the device and ended the call without explanation. His colleague across from him sat motionless, his fork suspended halfway between his plate and his mouth, marinara sauce dripping unnoticed onto his expensive tie. At table 12, an elderly couple who had been arguing quietly about their son's failed marriage reached across the table simultaneously and clasped hands, their dispute forgotten in the presence of something that reminded them of beauty they had stopped noticing decades ago. A young mother near the window had been struggling with a fussy toddler who refused to eat his pasta and kept throwing crayons on the floor. The child fell silent as the music washed over him, his small face turning toward the source of the sound with an expression of wonder that made his mother's eyes fill with tears. She pulled out her phone not to complain or to document something ridiculous, but because she instinctively knew she was witnessing something rare and wanted to capture it before it disappeared like morning mist. The servers stood scattered throughout the dining room like statues, their professional masks slipping to reveal genuine human emotion. Maria, who had been working at Marcello's for 8 years and prided herself on remaining unaffected by the dramas that unfolded around her nightly, found herself unable to move. She held a tray of dirty dishes that suddenly felt too heavy, and she carefully set it down on an empty table so she could listen without distraction. Tears ran down her cheeks unchecked, and she did not understand why this music affected her so deeply until she realized it reminded her of her own grandmother's funeral, of loss and memory, and the way certain melodies can unlock doors inside the heart that we keep carefully bolted. The bartender with the tattooed arms had pulled out his phone as well, recording the performance with hands that were not quite steady. He had been a music major in college before dropping out to take care of his sick father, and he recognized immediately that what he was hearing was not the work of an amateur or a street performer with delusions of talent. This was a trained musician, someone with years of serious study behind them, someone who understood not just how to play the notes but how to make them speak. He watched Natalia's hands moving across the keys and saw technique that belonged on concert stages, not in the corner of an Italian restaurant on a rainy Tuesday. Even the skeptics, those who had been loudest in their mockery and dismissal, found themselves silenced. The man who had made the bet about how quickly this would become a disaster sat with his credit card still in his hand, his intention to leave early completely forgotten. The woman who had complained about being subjected to a homeless person's delusions stared at Natalia with an expression that mingled shame and astonishment, as though she were being forced to confront her own capacity for cruelty and finding the reflection uncomfortable. Vincent himself stood rooted to his spot near the bar, and for the first time in years he felt something crack open inside his chest. He had grown up in a household where his father played violin and his mother sang opera, where music had been as essential as food or air. But somewhere along the way, building a business and paying bills and managing staff and dealing with suppliers and all the endless mundane demands of adult life, he had stopped really listening. Music had become background noise, something to fill silence but not something that demanded attention or stirred the soul. Now, hearing this bedraggled woman coaxing such beauty from his dusty piano, he remembered what it felt like to be moved by art, to be reminded that there were things in the world that mattered beyond profit margins and Yelp reviews. Natalia played through the nocturne's final section, where the melody returned transformed by everything that had come before, sadder and wiser and somehow more beautiful for its melancholy. Her touch was delicate on the keys now, each note placed with exquisite care, the dynamics ranging from barely audible whispers to moments of gentle intensity. The injured hand that had betrayed her so catastrophically years ago was cooperating, the fingers remembering their purpose, the muscle memory proving stronger than scar tissue and pain. She played the final phrases with a tenderness that felt almost unbearable, the notes hanging in the air like questions without answers, like prayers sent into darkness with no certainty of being heard. The last chord faded slowly, the sound lingering in the restaurant's air like perfume or smoke, and then there was silence. Complete, absolute, profound silence. No one moved, no one spoke, no one seemed to breathe. Natalia lifted her hands from the keys and placed them in her lap. She sat very still, her head bowed, her wet hair hanging around her face like a curtain. She had no idea what was happening behind her because she was still half lost in the music, still dwelling in that other place where pain could be transformed into beauty and suffering could be given voice. She waited for the laughter to begin, for the dismissive comments, for Vincent to tell her to leave now that she had fulfilled her end of the bargain. Instead, someone began to clap. It was the elderly man at table 12, his weathered hands coming together with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the silence. His wife joined him immediately, and then the businessman at table 7, and then the young mother near the window. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted into applause that rolled through the space like thunder, like a storm breaking, like a dam finally giving way under impossible pressure. People rose from their seats, still clapping, some of them shouting words of praise and amazement. The servers joined in, abandoning all pretense of professional detachment. The hostess who had tried to turn Natalia away stood with her hand pressed over her mouth, tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, her shoulders shaking with sobs she could not control. The bartender set down his phone and applauded so hard his palms began to sting. Vincent walked toward the piano with tears running freely down his face, not caring who saw them or what they might think. He had served thousands of meals and hosted countless events, but he knew with absolute certainty that nothing in his professional life had prepared him for this moment. He approached Natalia carefully, as though she might startle and flee if he moved too quickly. She turned to look at him finally, and he saw in her eyes a mixture of disbelief and hope and fear that made his heart ache. The applause continued, growing louder rather than fading, people refusing to stop until Natalia acknowledged them. She stood slowly, unsteadily, turning to face the room full of strangers who were no longer looking at her with contempt or pity, but with something that looked remarkably like reverence. She saw phones pointed in her direction, recording this moment, and instead of feeling exposed, she felt somehow witnessed, as though these strangers were confirming that she still existed, that she was still real. The first video appeared on social media at 9:47 that evening, posted by the young mother who had been dining with her toddler. She titled it simply, "Homeless Woman Plays Piano for Food and Leaves Everyone Speechless," and included a caption explaining what she had witnessed. The video was shaky, recorded on a phone held in trembling hands, but the audio captured the haunting beauty of Chopin's Nocturne and the stunned silence that followed. She posted it to her personal account, which had maybe 300 followers, and went to bed thinking a few friends might find it interesting. By midnight, the video had been shared 2,000 times. By 3 in the morning, it had reached 50,000 views. By the time the sun rose over Seattle on Wednesday morning, it had been viewed more than 2 million times and was spreading across platforms like wildfire. The bartender's video, posted from a different angle and capturing Natalia's face more clearly, gained similar traction. Other diners who had recorded the performance uploaded their footage as well, and soon there were half a dozen versions of the same miraculous moment circulating through the digital world. People tagged friends with messages saying, "You have to watch this, and I'm actually crying. And this is the most beautiful thing I've seen all year." The videos jumped from personal accounts to larger pages dedicated to uplifting content, to music appreciation groups, to forums where classical music enthusiasts debated technique and interpretation. Someone identified the piece as Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major and noted that the performance, despite being played on an upright piano in a restaurant by someone in obvious distress, showed remarkable technical skill and emotional depth. Comments flooded in from around the world. A piano teacher in Tokyo wrote that she had played this same nocturne for 40 years and had never heard it performed with such raw honesty. A music student in Berlin commented that whoever this woman was, she had received serious classical training because the phrasing and dynamics were not those of an amateur. A retired concert pianist in London said the performance had moved her to tears and reminded her why she had fallen in love with music in the first place. But alongside the praise came questions. Who was this woman? What was her story? How did someone with such extraordinary talent end up homeless and desperate enough to play for food? The mystery deepened the fascination. People began calling Marcello's restaurant, overwhelming the phone lines, asking if anyone knew the pianist's name or how to contact her. Vincent, exhausted and still emotionally raw from the previous evening, told reporters who showed up at his door that he did not know her name, that she had simply walked in out of the rain and asked to play. The local news stations picked up the story by Wednesday afternoon. Reporters stood outside Marcello's interviewing diners who had been present, filming the piano where Natalia had sat, trying to piece together information about the mysterious musician who had vanished back into the city after Vincent had given her a full meal and $100 in cash. The story aired on the evening news with the headline "Homeless Pianist Stuns Seattle Restaurant" and included excerpts from the viral video along with interviews with witnesses who described the experience as life-changing. Among the millions of people who saw the footage was Michael Chen, the music director of the Seattle Symphony. He was sitting in his home office on Wednesday evening, scrolling through social media while reviewing scores for an upcoming season, when the video appeared in his feed. He almost scrolled past it, assuming it would be another feel-good story with mediocre playing amplified by sympathy, but something made him pause. He clicked play and turned up the volume on his computer speakers. Within 30 seconds, Michael sat forward in his chair, his attention completely captured. Within a minute, he had closed the score he had been studying and was listening with the focused intensity he usually reserved for auditions and masterclasses. By the time the video ended, he had watched it 3 more times, analyzing the technique, the interpretation, the way her hands moved across the keys. This was not a talented amateur. This was someone with conservatory-level training, someone who understood the architecture of the music and possessed the technical facility to execute her vision. Michael began making phone calls immediately. He called colleagues in the music community, asking if anyone knew of a homeless woman with classical piano training. He called the restaurant and spoke with Vincent, explaining who he was and expressing his serious interest in finding this musician. He posted on professional forums and reached out to music schools and conservatories asking if any of their former students might fit the description. Someone suggested he contact homeless shelters and outreach organizations, and he began working his way through a list, leaving messages and sending photos captured from the video. Meanwhile, the story continued to spread. Major news outlets picked it up by Thursday morning. Good Morning America featured the video in their uplifting news segment. The BBC ran a story about the mysterious Seattle pianist. Newspapers across the country published articles with headlines asking, "Who is the homeless piano virtuoso?" and "The woman who played Chopin for a plate of pasta." The video had been viewed more than 20 million times across all platforms, and Natalia's face, though partially obscured by wet hair in most of the footage, had been seen by people in dozens of countries. Organizations dedicated to helping homeless populations began receiving donations, with notes saying the money was inspired by the pianist's story. Music schools announced scholarship programs for students facing hardship. People debated in comment sections about the failures of society that allowed talented individuals to fall through the cracks. Others argued about mental health care and addiction services and the lack of support for artists. The story became a mirror in which everyone saw their own concerns and convictions reflected back. Vincent found himself at the center of unexpected attention. His restaurant was fully booked for weeks in advance, with people hoping to sit in the same room where the performance had taken place, to see the piano that had been played, to feel some connection to the moment that had moved millions. He gave interview after interview, always emphasizing that Natalia deserved the credit, that he had simply made the obvious choice when faced with someone asking for a chance. He kept the $100 she had refused to take that night, telling reporters he was holding it for her until she could be found. The hostess who had tried to turn Natalia away became the subject of online criticism when someone mentioned her initial reaction. She posted a tearful apology video acknowledging her prejudice and explaining that the experience had fundamentally changed how she viewed people experiencing homelessness. Her video went viral as well, sparking conversations about snap judgments and the invisible humanity of people society trains us to overlook. By Friday morning, 3 days after Natalia had walked into the restaurant, the combined videos had been viewed nearly 50 million times. The story had taken on a life of its own, becoming bigger than any single performance or individual. It had become a phenomenon, a cultural moment that meant different things to different people, but resonated with something universal about talent, dignity, second chances, and the unexpected places where beauty can be found. And through it all, Natalia herself remained missing, somewhere in the streets of Seattle, completely unaware that her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. Natalia spent the 2 days following her performance at Marcello's in a fog of exhaustion and confusion. The meal Vincent had given her, a generous plate of lasagna with bread and salad, had been the most food she had eaten in a single sitting in months. Her stomach, unaccustomed to such abundance, had rebelled slightly. But the nourishment had given her enough energy to find a relatively safe doorway several blocks away where she could sleep through the night without being disturbed. She had no idea that videos of her performance were circulating around the world, that millions of people were watching her play, that her face was appearing on news broadcasts and social media feeds across continents. She did not own a phone or have access to the internet. The public library, where homeless individuals sometimes used computers, had been her occasional refuge, but she had not been there in weeks. The news playing on televisions in store windows or restaurants meant nothing to her because she rarely stopped to watch, too focused on the immediate concerns of survival to pay attention to current events. She existed in a bubble of isolation that the modern connected world struggled to penetrate. On Friday afternoon, she was sitting near Pike Place Market with a cardboard sign asking for help when a young woman approached her with unusual intensity. The woman, probably in her mid-20s with kind eyes and a nervous energy, crouched down and asked if her name was Natalia. Something in the specificity of the question made Natalia's heart race with fear. She had learned to be wary of people who seemed to know things about her, who asked too many questions, who showed too much interest. In her experience, such attention rarely led anywhere good. She started to gather her things to leave, but the woman spoke quickly, explaining that she was a volunteer with a homeless outreach organization and that someone very important was looking for her. A man named Michael Chen from the Seattle Symphony had been calling shelters and outreach groups with a description matching Natalia's appearance, and he desperately wanted to speak with her about a performance she had given at a restaurant. The woman pulled out her phone and showed Natalia a video, and suddenly she was watching herself from 3 nights ago, sitting at the piano in Marcello's, playing Chopin while people recorded on their phones. Natalia stared at the screen in disbelief. The video had numbers beneath it that made no sense to her at first, millions of views and hundreds of thousands of shares and comments in languages she could not read. The woman explained gently that Natalia had become famous, that people all over the world had seen her play, that the Seattle Symphony's music director wanted to meet her. Natalia felt dizzy and disoriented, as though reality had suddenly shifted into something unrecognizable. This had to be some kind of mistake or trick or cruel joke, but the woman was patient and persistent. She made a phone call, and within 20 minutes Michael Chen himself arrived at Pike Place Market, slightly out of breath from rushing across downtown Seattle. He was a distinguished man in his 50s with graying hair and an intensity that reminded Natalia painfully of her old professors. He sat down on the sidewalk next to her, seemingly unconcerned about his expensive coat touching the dirty pavement, and spoke to her in a voice that carried both excitement and genuine respect. He told her he had watched the video dozens of times, that her performance had been extraordinary, that he recognized conservatory-level training in her technique and interpretation. He asked about her background, and slowly, haltingly, Natalia found herself telling her story. She spoke about St. Petersburg and the Moscow Conservatory, about her injury and the loss of her career, about the descent into addiction and the betrayal that had left her stranded in Seattle. Michael listened without interruption, his expression growing more compassionate and more determined with each revelation. When she finished speaking, Michael made her an offer that seemed to come from some alternate universe where dreams still came true. He said he wanted her to audition for the symphony, that if her playing was as strong as the video suggested, he could offer her opportunities to perform as a guest soloist. But first, he said, she needed stability and medical care and time to rebuild her strength and her life. He had already spoken with several organizations and individuals who wanted to help. There were doctors willing to examine her hand free of charge, physical therapists eager to volunteer their services, and a local benefactor who had offered to provide temporary housing. Natalia wanted to believe him, but years of disappointment and betrayal had taught her that hope was dangerous. She asked what he wanted in return, what the catch was, why anyone would help someone like her who had nothing to offer. Michael's answer was simple and devastating in its sincerity. He said that talent like hers was rare and precious, that the world needed beauty and art, and that allowing someone with her gifts to disappear into the streets would be a tragedy that diminished everyone. He said she did not need to offer anything in return except the willingness to try, to accept help, to give herself a chance at recovery. The outreach worker, whose name was Sarah, added that dozens of organizations wanted to contribute to Natalia's support. The viral video had inspired an outpouring of generosity, with people donating money specifically earmarked to help her. A crowdfunding campaign set up by a viewer had raised over $200,000 in 3 days. There was more than enough to cover medical care, housing, food, and anything else she might need while getting back on her feet. Natalia broke down crying on the sidewalk near Pike Place Market, great heaving sobs that came from a place deeper than words could reach. Michael and Sarah sat with her, not trying to stop her tears or rush her through the emotion, simply bearing witness to the release of months and years of accumulated pain and fear and hopelessness. Other people walking past stared, some with concern and others with the studied indifference of city dwellers accustomed to public displays of distress, but none of them recognized that they were watching a resurrection, a woman being pulled back from the edge of an abyss that had nearly swallowed her completely. That evening, Natalia slept in a bed for the first time in 8 months. The apartment provided by the benefactor was small but clean, a studio in a building that specialized in transitional housing for people recovering from homelessness. It had a bathroom with hot water, a kitchen with a refrigerator that Sarah had stocked with food, and a bed with sheets that smelled like laundry detergent instead of mildew and street grime. Natalia stood in the shower for 30 minutes, watching months of accumulated dirt swirl down the drain, scrubbing her skin until it was pink and raw, washing her hair 3 times because she could not quite believe it was getting clean. The following Monday, she met with Dr. Patricia Williams, an orthopedic surgeon who specialized in hand injuries for musicians. Dr. Williams examined Natalia's right hand carefully, taking x-rays and conducting tests to assess range of motion and nerve function. The news was cautiously optimistic. The original surgery had been adequate but not excellent, and scar tissue had formed in ways that restricted movement. However, with aggressive physical therapy and possibly a minor revision surgery, Dr. Williams believed significant improvement was possible. She could not promise that Natalia would return to full concert-level capability, but she saw no reason why substantial recovery could not be achieved. Physical therapy began immediately, 3 sessions per week with a therapist named Marcus who had worked with injured musicians for 20 years. The exercises were painful and frustrating, pushing her hand through movements it wanted to resist, stretching tissue that had grown tight and uncooperative. But Marcus was patient and encouraging, celebrating small victories and never expressing doubt about her potential for recovery. He gave her exercises to practice at home and taught her techniques for managing pain without relying on medication that might lead back to the addiction she was trying to escape.